Greetings. I am Gabriel from the Union of the Enlightened. Are you familiar with the stories of the so-called underground civilizations, cities and secret communities? I dare to suggest that, given the baggage of knowledge that you have behind your back, you have heard such stories more than once. You ask, Illuminati? No, not really. In fact, things are a little more complicated than it seems to the uninitiated. Those whom you call the Illuminati are actually known as the Brotherhood, and in addition have a much more complex structure than you might know from the most reliable sources. This includes communities, and smaller organizations of which even I have a very vague idea. However, that organization, or group to which I belong, occupies its own place in the overall picture, so to speak. Most people have not heard anything about her, if only due to the fact that she, as a rule, unnoticed from the outside observes the evolution of mankind as a species and, in particular, its spiritual growth, sometimes pushing it forward through the knowledge transmitted to the mass consciousness of many through individual people in the field of art, literature and cinema. And so our story began when our ancestors were among those who managed to hide in underground cities in time and waited until everything calmed down on the planet devastated by a global catastrophe with survivors on the surface and what to do next. Many believed that it was not worth it and it was unlikely that the technology and knowledge that had been preserved would now help the surviving feral and degraded groups of people scattered across the planet, while another equally large group insisted that help was needed and worth a try. Over time, they decided to come to the surface and at different points on this planet became gods for the survivors. This is, in brief, the history of our community and how exactly we were separated from the majority and retained our knowledge of ability and technology. Now I will tell you a little more about the community in which I am an ordinary member, and I hope this information will give you more food for thought regarding who I really am. As I said, our community includes the heirs of several very ancient bloodlines or clans, and as you understand from what I said above, all who are part of our secret organization are practically the descendants of those whom you call the gods of antiquity. Moreover, if we talk strictly about our community, then here we will talk more about the gods of the ancient Slavic and German Scandinavian pantheon. Now I will try to briefly tell you about how our organization actually works. So, our community has a very clear and an orderly structure and in total has no less than 1 million members. It represents one of those highly developed underground communities or civilizations that you have heard so much about. Outwardly, we represent the same classic Nordic type that can so often be found in your art, cinema, comics, painting and sculpture, in particular on the canvases of the artists of the Renaissance and further, who wrote on ancient themes. The average time of our life is 800 years, which is at least 10 times longer than yours. I will say even more. Designations so well known to you as, for example, Asgard or Shambhala are actually nothing more than convenient shortcuts that were actually attached to our community and our other relatives in the course of history and in this form have come down to your time. But for ease of perception, you can easily call us such well-known names as, for example, the Great White Brotherhood, the Brotherhood of the Grail, the Brotherhood of Odin, or, for example, the Union of the Enlightened. As I said, we had and still have many names. And of course there is very specific places in your world where there are some kind of natural portals through which you can, with certain knowledge, get into our world. Our main task is to observe the events that are happening in the world, track prophecies about future changes, as well as store knowledge, which in the future should play an important role in the fate of mankind in the transition to a different form of existence. Most of us, like our ancestors, so at different times in the history of mankind, who played the role of enlighteners and helped raise the level of consciousness of society through literature and art, and later cinema and music, still consider their main task to be the transmission of the most important knowledge for the awakening of mankind through certain chosen people, as a rule, also from among scientists, inventors, historians, researchers, scriptwriters and directors, as well as artists and composers. As a rule, this is done either directly, which happens quite rarely, or by telepathic means. That is, if, for example, we are faced with a new project and we must introduce some idea into society, but so that it is not particularly intrusive, then one of us is appointed as a kind of curator, informant and patron, sometimes according to your earthly time for a rather long time over one person, as a rule, from among the most gifted and creative. The appointed one begins at first to unobtrusively penetrate telepathically into consciousness his protege often during sleep, and sometimes in the middle of the working day and inspire him with some idea, but so that he thought that he was not inspired, but his type was inspired by the muse, or he came to this himself. The main task is to bring a person to such a state that he will give up everything and sometimes start like an obsessive work on the idea planted in his mind, be it a book, a film, a picture or something else. A mission is considered complete if what its creator presents to the public pushes some certain boundaries in the minds of people and shifts established stereotypes or cliches, completely changing people's lives and the entire course of world culture. We also often work with inventors and, as I said, brilliant screenwriters and writers, so that a lot of what you see around you, namely outstanding pictures, films, musical works, as well as inventions without which life is simply unthinkable, as a rule, appeared thanks to our suggestion through specially gifted individuals. Antiquity, they were gods who were responsible for the development of arts and literature. Well, or, in the end, muses. And this is all of us. This is our main vocation. And finally, I will say a little about myself and our political and social views. Our union of several communes is far from homogeneous, and as I said above, from the very beginning in our ranks and among our ancestors predominantly there were two main points of view regarding how we should behave in relation to people living on the surface of this planet. Accordingly, I would designate these two groups in accordance with your generally accepted terminology as a kind of right-wing radicals and moderates. Among right-wing radicals there is, and their own division into ultra-radicals and moderates, while those who belong to the first group have always adhered to the doctrine of a monoracial society and the superiority of the Nordic race over the rest. They are not just against sharing knowledge and technology with anyone, but also dreaming about how to arrange on this planet their own subordinate monoracial society and get rid of or radically reduce the ranks of all other representatives of the so-called colored races. Can you imagine that, as a rule, they inspire their various protégés on the surface of this planet? Moderate radicals simply believe that everyone who inhabits this planet, or at least a vast majority, and representatives of colored races, in particular, are just a bunch of ignorant, self-righteous and lazy savages who are incapable of anything and, as a consequence, unworthy of the knowledge and technologies that they have us. They are also ardent supporters of a monoracial society and are very intolerant of interracial unions and representatives of races other than Nordic. Fortunately, there are less than half of them in total. The rest belong to the group of moderates, of which I and my comrades in arms are included. Our ancestors, however, like us now, have always been of the opinion that the weak and lacking knowledge always have the right and the chance to help. It was our ancestors who were among those who are known to you from myths as civilizing gods. However, like many other groups that retain knowledge and technology, they were among those who tried to raise humanity from its knees at least a little and give them the basics of those skills that would be useful for them to survive and not to run wild. However, as you can see from the title, we adhere precisely to moderate views, which means we still act within certain frameworks. So, for example, we do not support the idea of creating a monoracial society on this planet as ultra-radicals and are tolerant of all representatives of others. We honor the laws of creation and the personal qualities of a person, regardless of his race or confession. However, our moderation is as follows. Despite all of the above, we have always strictly adhered to by virtue of certain genetic laws and laws of creation, which are above us, and we are not subject to the doctrines of monoracial marriages exclusively in our ranks. Otherwise we would not have been able to preserve over the past thousands of years that our clans exist knowledge of skills and certain genetic characteristics inherent in our species, which are responsible, for example, for longevity or the absence of many diseases and strong immunity. While I said many of us are quite tolerant of interracial marriages on this planet, believing that everyone has free will to commit this or that act and, accordingly, be responsible for everything, and so we never interfere or suggest anything that runs counter to this order of things. In our own ranks, we are forced to observe this law very strictly due to the above circumstances. As for knowledge and technology, I will give a small analogy. For radicals in general, both moderate and ultra-persuasive, people are like ragamuffins children, dirty and unintelligent, always asking for handouts, which, of course, they are not going to throw them. We believe that children, figuratively speaking, should be shod, dressed well-fed and warm, but in no case should they be allowed to play matches with firearms or sharp objects. In a word, what they do not understand at all and do not have the necessary qualities and knowledge to manage it without harming themselves or others. There are two types of technologies that we would very much like to introduce into your society, but this is very often hindered by people who are not profitable and those that even we, with all our respect for people, would not dare to introduce into your society, since at this moment, and it is difficult to disagree with this, the majority are simply not prepared for them, or their implementation will be fraught with irreversible negative consequences for you. This is also where certain moderation is for the rest. As you might have noticed, we have already done a decent job shifting your technological development in recent years to such distances that previous generations could not even dream of. In general, if there is a desire to learn more about this dynamic of relations between our groups and in general to humanity, read some myths and you will understand everything. In conclusion, I would like to say the following. We will discuss in the future the nature of measurements and creation in general, and therefore, before we go into this topic, I would just like to say that in general, our organization, like all its members, due to innate abilities and available technologies, is located mainly not so much in the world of people. That is, in this dimension, how much in a higher parallel, known to you as the world of the gods, being in which opens up much wider horizons for all of us. That, nevertheless, does not deprive us of the ability to spend some time at will in this world. But more on that later.